right next to where I can mute. So
mine is too. I'm using a Mac. Let's see. Oh, okay. I think this will do it. Yes, good. Okay.
yay. Stacy, what about you? How does the tech side look on your end?
I think it looks fine.
Good, yeah, and I can hear you well.
Okay, great. If I had the ability, I was going to show a picture, but it looks like I don't, which is also okay.
Yeah, you will. If
Okay.
you want. Yeah, so Caitlin is one of she's listed as a host, so she's helping us out with sharing presenter duties. So only one person can do that at a time. So it's me right now, but she'll be moving it around as
okay.
So if you do want to do that, you can.
Super, thank you. Thanks for organizing everything. Sorry to pop at the last minute.
No, you're good.
From a different meeting. At least we can teleport.
I know, that's going to be my advising tomorrow, I think. I expect one more. I expect Elizabeth to be joining soon. She is booking across campus from teaching until 1:50, so she might come a little bit late, but I'll give folks maybe another minute or two, attendees to join, and then I'll kick us off in a couple minutes.
So Emily, I don't use WebEx a lot. If one of us is sort of on, does our picture become highlighted on this thing?
You know, I asked Nate the same question, and the end user, like any attendee, or you can even do this too, you can choose that. So on my screen, it's in the upper right. You can toggle between who's speaking can be the main person, or you can do a grid view so that you can see everybody at once. So
okay.
So you can change it on your end, and so can the attendees.
Oh, okay, great. Perfect. Yep. All right.
All right. Well, I think we'll get started. It looks like we have a bunch of people joining as attendees, so welcome everybody. I'm Emily Helder. I'm a professor in the psychology department, and I'm joined by 9 other panelists who you'll hear from, and I'll let them introduce themselves in just a little bit. But I thought I'd begin by just doing a couple word of thanks. Of course, thanks to all the panelists that are joining us, but also a special thanks to Jane Bruin, Nate Porter, Caitlin Rigdon for helping with various tech and organizational things. And I also want to say a special thanks to Alicia Marr. She's not a panelist today, but the idea for this panel came from a discussion that I had with her, and it's really her idea that she shared with me and encouraged me to pull together. And so I just want to share my appreciation to her for both her idea and her encouragement. So we're coming together today at this panel, and I want to give you a bit of context. So over the summer, in June, there was a on-campus prayer walk for anti-racism in the wake of George Floyd's killing. And after that prayer walk, faculty and staff started having some conversations with each other, which about how to more visibly discuss our commitments to anti-racism across campus, how to do that even in the classroom in better ways. And so the Black Lives Matter video was released as a way to start that conversation. And the feedback that I got on that video when I talked with students of color, alums of color, was that's great and all, but that it's a start. But I want to see the evidence of that. I want to hold the institution accountable for those conversations continuing to happen and things happening in the classroom. So I sort of see this panel as the next step in that, towards that process and as a part of that accountability. And so today we have members from a range of different departments. They're going to share a bit about how they're trying to embody anti-racism and their commitments to diversity and inclusion within the classroom. We offer these ideas with quite a bit of humility, knowing that all of us continue to have a lot of internal work to do, external work to do, learning to do. We're very eager, in fact, to hear from those of you that are attending this panel. If you have questions for us, feedback, suggestions, you've maybe encountered some of what we're trying to do in the classroom, and maybe you have some feedback for us. So the chat is open. I'll be monitoring that, and I would really welcome throughout the panel your feedback and questions for us. At the end, I will also be sharing a QR code because that's the way that attendance and the prizes that you can win for attending events is going to be done. So without further ado, I think we can get started. So I will ask each panelist if you would start by just introducing yourself and say your department. And then again, our common question that we'll all be talking about is how are you working to embody anti-racism in the classroom and your commitments to diversity and inclusion. And I think I asked Chad to start. Do you mind kicking us off, Chad?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Thanks, Emily. My name is Chad Engbers. I teach in the English department, and I have been here. Well, 2001 was my first year, so you can do the math. It's too much for an English prof to do. Been here for a long time. I'm very happy to be part of this panel. Like just about every other well-meaning white person that I know, I read the book White Fragility over the summer, and was really, I've had this experience with anti-racism workshops before too. Found it almost paralyzing to realize just the enormity of the problem and the depth. And I sat down and I said to myself, what's one thing you can take out of this book and work on? What's one thing I can actually do so that I don't just have the experience of reading the book? What's something that's going to last? And I was most struck, I found myself going back to the part in that book where she says that there are unspoken rules that white people have for being confronted on their own racism. So, well, you didn't tell me in person, and you didn't tell me when it happened, and you've got all of these ways to dodge and deflect. And I started to think, well, how would I be open to criticism or observation of things that I might have said of a discriminatory nature in the classroom? And I thought, well, I've been teaching for 25 years and I've never had a single complaint. And on the one hand, that's great, but on the other hand, it simply cannot be that in those 25 years, I've never said anything problematic. And I think that the people in my classroom, they know those rules, and I think they haven't felt maybe free to call me on it. So I wasn't sure that's a record I can be proud of, and I thought, how do I open myself to that work, to being confronted on that? So I tried to develop a statement for my syllabus, encouraging students to be honest with me if they heard me saying or doing anything that minimized them or another student in any kind of way. I give them the name of and the email address of my chair. I say, you can do this however you want to. You can do it anonymously. You can come together as a group. You can do it on behalf of someone else. You can go through my chair. You can go through my dean. I'll take that feedback any which way whatsoever. So that was my start. But I think the two things that I wanted to talk about today are sort of developments of that. And those are the issues of audience and sincerity, because I very quickly realized I don't think that's going to work. I'm not sure that a statement in a syllabus is really going to make a student of color who feels that I've said or think something. I'm not sure it's going to give them the license and the authority to confront me. And there are some real problems with that statement that I really haven't grappled with yet, and we can talk about those in a discussion section sometime. But it also occurred to me that I'm not really just intending that students for the audience of students of color who might need to confront me. I would hope that my openness makes those conversations easier to have in some context. But it occurred to me that a lot of my students, they won't be in that situation. A lot of my students are white. They have never really been the victims of racism. Some of them, I think, are even skeptical of anti-racism and skeptical of diversity and inclusion statements, willing to dismiss it as political correctness. And I thought for those students, it is important for them to hear that I care about this, that I'm trying to make this statement, and I want to get across that value to them. Sort of picking up on what I thought was so wonderful about that video over the summer is there were just multiple faculty members all sharing this commitment, and it was a sort of overwhelming in terms of the population of professors who were saying this. I wanted to join that crowd even though I wasn't in the video. But then I thought, okay, so somebody who's skeptical of all of this thinks that, okay, so here's a prof whose school made him give this boilerplate statement on diversity and inclusion. How do I convince that person that I'm sincere? Because I sometimes think that to say things superficially is almost worse than not saying them at all, right? If you take something really important and make it sound really trite, you're not only not making it important, you're actually pushing it down, you're making it smaller. So how do I give this depth and rigor? So what I tried to do is to anchor the statement both in the syllabus itself and in a welcome video that I made to students. In my role, in my beliefs as a Christian, which I hope we all have in common, but then also specifically in my discipline. And the two questions that I would give to people today to just think about are the ones that I thought were really, really useful for me. And they are these. Why is diversity important in my discipline? And then the flip side of that would be question 2, how does racism harm my discipline? I think if we can answer those questions for our students, we do an awful lot of good, even for students who've never really encountered racism before. I think this is part of what was really moving to me about the video over the summer, is that there were people from so many disciplines talking about this issue not in a common voice, because they were all coming from different angles and saying, here's what anti-racism looks like in English. Here's what it means in history and in psychology. So I really had to kind of dig into the principles of my discipline. And, you know, I now have students saying back to me, we read literature to experience difference, because that's one of the things that I ended up with. So even when you read a trashy romance novel, you presumably read that because your own love life isn't all that great and it's different from yours. So even bad literature you read to experience somebody who's different from yourself. And as I explained to students, any comment that I make that minimizes differences or excludes different voices, marginalizes different voices, that goes against my belief as a Christian. It goes against my belief in students as image bearers of God, but then it also works against my goals as an English professor of multiplying the differences that we experience by reading literature. So that's a little bit of my progress, and my two encouragements to people would be to think about how these commitments are anchored specifically in your discipline. I sure love the idea of students in the first 2 weeks of classes hearing that from me, and then hearing something from a different angle from Emily, and then hearing something from a different angle from Steve. And I think once we do that, students will get the sense, wow, this is real. The university really cares about this, and here are multiple ways for me to talk about it.
Yes. So much for sharing. Yeah. And I'm glad we have the panel to represent the broad discipline. So I think, Tracy, I asked whether you'd be willing to speak next to those same issues. Oh, I'll let you unmute yourself. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, so my name is Tracy Caparis. I teach in the Political Science Department and the Global Development Studies program. And I want to thank Emily for organizing this. And I too look forward to my colleagues' comments and student feedback. So we only have 5 minutes, and I'm going to be very brief. My commentary was going to be on my addressing systemic racism and structural violence within the field, one of the fields that I teach in regularly, global development studies, and in a particular class I'm teaching this semester. And I've been more intentional this semester about doing that whenever the opportunity arises. So that's what I'm going to talk about as it pertains to, again, just one of the classes, GDS 351, which is called National and Regional Development. And so let me move ahead with that. And by the way, I'm going to say a little bit about GDS because I think for students who are joining in, maybe you're not as familiar with the field. But the field as a whole tries to address why poverty and oppression exists in the world. It focuses in particular on countries in the global south, so countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And a typical career might involve working for World Vision or the Gates Foundation. And if you're working with those organizations, you would be interested in answering the key question we ask in this particular course, GDS 351, which is, why is it that some states in our world face the challenges of poverty and oppression more than others? So it's an effort at figuring out why and how human and community flourishing is stifled, and then more positively, how it can be encouraged. So the explanations in the field, the answers are all over the place, and a lot of them rest in economics, politics, or culture. So countries are poor because they've adopted the wrong economic policies. They're poor because they have weak political institutions, or they're poor because they have the lack of a progressive culture is what it's called. So many of the scholars in the field ignore the roles that systemic injustice and structural violence play in explaining how and why poverty exists. Now, we always cover this explanation in the course, but generally we've focused on a country where structural violence is prevalent, like Rwanda or Myanmar. This semester, I included readings that focused on the Black Lives Matter movement and then demonstrations this summer. And so we set aside a class period to talk about how the reality of systemic racism, how that connects with underdevelopment in the United States. So this course is a really good medium to discuss how systemic racism anywhere is a denial of human flourishing everywhere. It's the inverse of development. And if we're committed to building peaceful communities where everyone thrives, then we have to name the elephant in the room and combat it with every ounce of our being. So I've done this more intentionally this semester as it pertains to the United States, but I know I could do a lot more. So sort of picking up on what Chad said earlier, the field of global development itself, I think, can give off the impression that you can pat yourself on the back. You're doing everything you need to do. You're doing really good work. You're addressing poverty. And you don't really have to talk about these kinds of issues, but that's hardly the case. So this field took off in the 50s, and it had two blind spots right off the bat. The first was this white savior mentality, where we, the white West, can save the global South. You know, we can save these poor people in these other regions of the world. So it was steeped in othering and paternalism and racist stereotyping. The second blind spot is related to the first. There's this impression that global North countries are developed, they're flourishing, they can teach these other regions how to become developed. And I think that's a false narrative. I think it's a dangerous narrative. So, you know, it's false because we know that suffering and flourishing are everywhere. They're not bound to one region of the world. And it's dangerous because it assumes that, countries in the global North can be absolved of the reality that their economic flourishing has happened off the backs of peoples in the global South. So as Christians that teach in the field of global development, we have to lament and confess the systemic racism within the field and really work at deconstructing those practices, whatever they are, global health, politics, you name it. So we've got a long way to go, but that's what I was going to share.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tracy. It's really helpful to hear from their sort of firsthand view of where they're seeing that. So yeah, thank you. Steve, sorry, I'm going off my list. Steve, would you mind jumping in and sharing your perspective? Oh, hold on, you're muted.
Is it possible to share my screen?
Caitlin, do you mind swapping Steve over to be the presenter?
You should be able to now.
Thank you, Caitlin. Is my screen showing? Is my screen showing, Emily?
Not yet.
No, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Now it is.
great. Thanks for your patience. I am still learning WebEx. I'm comfortable with Teams, but not WebEx.
You're good. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. I think I'll start by underscoring what Chad and Tracy underscored, is focusing on the ways in which systematic racism and white supremacy has colored the discipline of history, and it's colored it white. History as a discipline, when it was first developing in the 19th century, was developed by white European and Euro-American men. And so history, in its very nature, is racist and sexist. The way I think about history has been shaped and influenced by the professors I've had, and Reverend Jamar Tisby, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Mississippi, has articulated, I think, quite well what history to me is. History is activism. And so I'm going to briefly, in the 5 minutes I have, share how that philosophy, that belief, informs my research, it informs my teaching, and it informs my activism. I'm just going to briefly share how that influences my work as a historian. So first, I'm actually going to start with teaching. Forgive the order. I'm going to first begin with teaching. So I teach two courses. Well, I'm teaching two courses this semester. History 229, which I've taught for a number of years now. The students who take that course are typically juniors and seniors, and they're in the secondary education, social studies, or history program, which means they want to teach history to middle schoolers and high schoolers. You can imagine the weight of responsibility in doing that, because they are now going to be the ones to now tell the story. And so one of the books I assign them is this book by James Loewen. He's a sociologist. He's not a historian. For a project, James Loewen ordered the 12 leading U.S. history textbooks used with middle schoolers and high schoolers in the United States. And you can see what he thought of those textbooks. He argues in this book, which the students in 229 are currently reading and have read, that U.S. history textbooks and the teachers who use them lie to their students. And the lie they're telling is that white Europeans and white Euro-Americans have shaped the United States only. And so the lies are told. Another way of thinking about it is historians, history teachers, and history textbooks for over a century have silenced ethnic minority peoples in the United States and teach to white students. And that's the story they want to tell, to celebrate and create patriots. I also teach History 358, which is Native American history. That's my field. And so the book I use in there is First Peoples, which centers Indigenous voices. In fact, it's a documentary survey. So how does that shape the way I teach those two courses? Well, one thing that I do in those courses is I center the voices of African Americans and Native Americans and Asian Americans and Latinx Americans in the course. Quite literally, the students in those courses are reading and listening to voices who have been largely marginalized in history, who've been silenced. In short, what I do in my work as a teacher is unsilence the past, to give voice to those who've been silenced. So Harriet Jacobs, just the other day, the students read an excerpt from her autobiography, which is such a powerful autobiography. At the bottom there, you see a wampum belt from the Lenni Lenapes. That was a wampum belt they gave to William Penn. This is just another example. I'm running out of time, so I won't go through this, but I think something Chad and Tracy said is worth mentioning is that not only when you unsilence the past, you unsilence the voices who've not been heard from before, but you also look at white people in a different lens too. And so just the other day, we read a diary from a white yeoman farmer, which was Jefferson's vision for the United States, an agrarian republic of white yeoman farmers. And I shared with the class, that's my great-great-grandpa. He was a white yeoman farmer in Missouri. And we talked about the values of the white yeoman farmers. What the students realized is, oh my word, those values still shape so many white Americans, including, as you see there in the value at the bottom, white supremacy. They valued evangelical Protestant Christian faith and their family and kin, but they corrupted that faith. It was corrupted by white supremacy. And I then tell my students, that's my great-great-grandpa. He was born and raised in Shelby County, Missouri, and that's his son, William. That's my great-great-grandpa. He fought for the Confederacy, and so did his son, William. They were white supremacists. And that is powerful, too. Another way I do that in the teaching is this evening, you're invited to join a screening of the recently released film Gather at 7 o'clock this evening. That is a film that gives voice to Indigenous peoples and talks about the ways in which Native American communities are fighting to regain their food sovereignty. And that's going to be screened tonight at 7 if you'd like to join. You can go to the Unlearn events page and secure a free ticket. It's free. And there's a post-screening panel discussion with professors from a variety of disciplines. So that's teaching. In my research, my first research project was on Native American Dutch relations in New Nederlands, which was a Dutch colony in what is now the state of New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Connecticut. The Dutch claimed that at one point. I've now, in my new project, I'm conducting research on race and religion in the Dutch Reformed Church in New York and New Jersey between 1772 and 1827, and have invited students, Calvin students, alongside who are conducting research with me. And what we're doing is we're unsilencing that past. Many Dutch Reformed Americans do not know how many Dutch Reformed Americans claimed Black people as property. It's a history that's been silenced. But so far, we've discovered that every single pastor of those Dutch Reformed churches claimed Black people as property, the pastors and many members of the congregation. But Dutch Reformed Americans don't want to know that story. So we're unsilencing that to confront that. Because if we're going to heal that wound, we have to let air into it and not cover it up. And then I've also engaged in activism, writing letters. I'm a part of many different activist organizations, but I also take it upon myself, much to some of my family members' chagrin, of going on Facebook and doing activism. So this is just one example on the screen. A Calvin alumni who's in my circle, who taught in Christian schools her entire career, posted this. And I replied, it's false information. Charles Wade was not a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter movement was founded by 3 Black women, one of whom is a Christian, by the way, I'd like to point out. And then underneath, I then said to this, by the way, just so happens, this is the mother of my closest friend who posted this. She's now since blocked me on Facebook. But then I pointed out, I'm wondering about the purpose of such a post, the arrest of a Black man in 2016 in the summer of 2020 with misleading information. It comes across at best as a dog whistle. So that shares a little bit of the ways in which I attempt to embody an anti-racist perspective, both in my teaching and my research and in my everyday life. Thanks, Emily.
Yeah, thanks so much, Steve. Sometimes when I chat with people about the Facebook activism, we call it trolling for Jesus. So keep it up. As Steve, I'll let you close down the share of your screen. On my side, it's kind of towards the top, but I think next on my list is Elizabeth, if you're willing to share a bit about what you're doing in your classes as well.
Yeah, thanks, Emily, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here and share what me as a part of SPA department, what I'm doing personally, but also what our department has been doing. So I'm Beth Thuman. I'm an associate professor here in the speech pathology and audiology department. And this has been something that, we've been talking about as a department for quite a few years. And these discussions were really informative because, first of all, we realized we may have been doing a lot of things, but particularly may not have been articulating it in the right manner to the students, and also not formalizing some of our attempts at diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'd like to share with you first what I've done personally for my courses, but then also some of our initiatives as a department. So first in my courses in summer, when Justice Chad and Justice Penny have sent us an email about including the diversity and inclusion statement in our syllabi. I wondered if I could incorporate something from the profession. So for audiologists and speech pathologists, one of the organizations the big organizations in the US is called ASHA, the American Speech and Hearing Organization. So we've been using these terms, diversity, equity, inclusion, but I really wanted to tie it in with this organizational as thinking about SPOT as a professional program. And I took the definitions of some of these key terms, like diversity and inclusion, and incorporate from ASHA and incorporated it into my syllabi. Because for me, I was looking for a working definition, because before I wanted to say I'm going to be doing these activities, I wanted people, or my students and myself, to be on the same page with respect to what exactly are those definitions. So that is something that I definitely was really excited about doing, but also for me, the path became a little more clearer because it's not always very clear with these terms when they're discussed. So that was really helpful. And again, tying it in with that professional program, their outlook, and it was nice to get that connection. I really appreciated, people were sharing in the community what they were including in these statements, because sometimes it's not easy to put words into a syllabi and it's a statement for everyone to see. So I've really appreciated the input that everyone was sharing. And we're all learners, we're all learning in this community together, and just articulating against some of those ground rules with respect to being respectful, and just as we're all growing in cultural humility with respect to the various topics that we'll discuss, professional, related to our profession or not related to our profession. So that was really informative for me. And I think that was really a good thing to include in our syllabi. So that's where I started with that. Another example I like to share is something that I did in my courses, and this is more related to cultural and linguistic diversity. One of the courses that I teach is swallowing disorders, and this is something very personal to me as well. But we always talk, before we talk about disorders, let's talk about what normal or typical is, and then what is normal and typical when we think about feeding and food and practices of feeding or feeding habits. So one of the assignments that I developed over the years, and it grew, it evolved, it was more of a discussion at first, and now it's more of a formal assignment, is I had students talk to other individuals who were not like them. So it could be a geographical difference, a cultural difference, whether a country, different country, but really talk to them about what is so personal to you, like your food and your feeding habits. How does that define you? What would we consider as normal? Because there is no normal when it comes to what you feed a 6-month-old baby and what should be a feeding habit for that family. So when we were discussing those assignments, it was so lovely to hear all the input, the effort that students had gone into to talk to someone who was very different from them, and articulate those experiences in from a learning perspective, what they've learned, and not necessarily from here's how it was different to mine, or here's how it's different to what we perceive as typical or normal. So for me, that was one of the really fun assignment to work with. And like I said, it came from a very personal, for me, it was very personal as well. So it was great to see the enthusiasm from students too. From a department, and I'm hearing this being articulated quite a bit from others as well, we wanted to formalize kind of channels of feedback. And that's something, whether it was an individual concern or this is something that a group of students felt, we wanted them to be able to reach out to us and chat to us about what they felt, and that would enable us to take some kind of, to learn from that, and also to figure out what can we do about this. So that was something, again, has been something that the department has been focusing on for the past 3 to 4 years, and formalizing those channels of feedback, whether it's reaching out to one of us, or there's a group of faculty mentors now that have been identified, and we talk to students about the availability of that feedback and availability of that resource. We're also focusing on developing our profession-specific diversity, equity, and inclusion activities, and really using that in the way we mentor the next generation of clinicians who are going to be working with individuals from different backgrounds. So that's something that we received a grant for, and we're able to implement some of these activities. And the first workshop that we're having is actually next week. And we're really focusing on first just awareness, reflection, and integration, and really thinking about it from our profession, for profession-specific activities. So thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share.
Yeah, thanks so much, Beth. I think next on the list, so I'll just keep talking. So as I said, I'm Emily Helder. I'm from the psychology department. A department that focuses on the flourishing of humans and really the science of thinking, behavior, emotion. So we should be well positioned based on the topics that we study to really be pushing students on this, to be processing a lot of issues that I think are relevant to this conversation. Research on prejudice, intergroup relations, etc. I think we always, as a department, need to continue to grow in how we're facilitating these conversations and that sort of thing. The thing I wanted to talk about more specifically today, though, is a class I teach that's within the psych department, but is not traditionally one where topics related to racism or diversity and inclusion necessarily come up in the specific content of the course, the textbook. It's a research design course. So it's taken by psychology students, by business students, I've taught it for many years. Last fall, so a little bit over a year ago, I started reflecting on how could I use that class, even though the content is much more about how do I design research, social science research studies, how could I use that class as a vehicle for talking about some of these issues. And so last year I developed a set of articles that are all correspond to the different research designs that we talk about, but are all from researchers who are looking at issues of bias. Most of them are about race bias. So about the impact of race bias, documenting its presence, and also evaluating programs to try to decrease bias or deconstruct biases. And so rather than assigning a whole bunch of articles of various topics, I pulled this kind of thread together. And I think it worked fairly well last year. I evaluated, what students thought. For the most part, the feedback was positive. When I got pushback, it was generally from students who I think, as Chad mentioned, maybe had not spent a lot of time thinking about race or processing race. And then they felt as though, I think they had been raised taking a more maybe colorblind approach. The lesson I learned from that is maybe as a professor, I want to do better in terms of, Chad, what you raised, this idea of like giving them context, like why is this important? Why is this, why am I picking this as a thread so that it can engage them. But generally my students of color in that class gave me more positive feedback about that. So in starting this fall, I wanted to continue that. So what I've done is try again to give a little bit more of that context for why we're talking about that. And also I spent the summer developing better, at least, I don't know, we'll see, but better to me discussion questions to lead student discussion about those articles and to have them reflect more deeply about the meaning of those research studies, what they mean for them, how they're applied to their kind of everyday life. So that's what I'm kind of working on in that class. Just what I think it underscores for me is that it doesn't have to be a class that we're teaching that's specifically about race for us to use our classroom space as a way to advance these discussions. What an ongoing challenge for me or something that I'm really focused on is that often when and I'm sure this is true in other classrooms, when I have students of color, they're often in the minority. Most of my students are white. And so I really am focused on making sure that when we're having these conversations, talking about these studies, that it's a safe space for especially those students of color. As a white woman leading those discussions, I want them to feel able to contribute to the discussion and at the same time not feel put on the spot or not feel as though they have to speak for a whole group if they don't feel like they want to share in that way. So that's ongoing learning from me, humility from me, seeking feedback from students. And if there's any students in attendance, please that have feedback for me, please feel free to reach out one-on-one or in whatever way you feel comfortable. So that's what I wanted to share. I think, Stacy, I think I asked you to go next if you would. Oh, and also, Caitlin, if you can make Stacy a presenter, I think she had a slide she wanted to share.
Thanks, Emily. I think I'm going to be following in your footsteps a little bit figuratively as well as literally. I'm going to see if sharing works or not.
Yep, it works.
It's like it does. Great news. So I am a member of the Department of Mathematics. And so what I mainly do is try to teach students to work with data. And there's no lack of data that speaks to the presence and effects of structural and institutional racism, and also talk about how data and algorithms and the way that we work with data can reinforce those problems. And so a naive idea would be to grab some of those data sets that connect to these issues and use those as the examples as you're learning data analysis methods. So I can tell you, I've tried it. It's not a very good idea because it just leads to cognitive overload in everybody, because you really need space and mental capacity to really understand what the issue you're thinking about is. And if you're using some of that capacity to learn a new analytical method and a new computer software at the same time, it's just a really huge challenge. So I still think it's possible, but I'm slowly, very slowly, trying to learn how to do it right. There's also a flurry of new books and writings and talks on this topic that I think are pretty useful. And so what I'm trying to do in one of my classes this fall is every week we're reading an excerpt from some of the different books that so Virginia Eubank's Automating Inequality, D'Ignazio and Klein's Data Feminism, Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology, Kathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction. She was at the January series last year. Safia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression. There are even more. So we're not reading the whole books, but just very brief excerpts to start a conversation. And then I try to follow up in the next week after that with one of those data sets that picks up that conversation. And so I'm hoping that maybe that leaves enough time and mental space to be able to have a class that's technical and also think about how the technical methods that we are learning can help us to understand and address some of the problems of racism. I also wanted to have a more positive aspect of the way I was trying to integrate diversity and inclusion into my class, because I feel like it can be really wearing for everybody if every time that race comes up, it's like, here's how people of color are getting beaten down and how life is unfair and terrible things that are happening. And that's obviously not the whole story. So one other thing that we're doing, and I have to admit that Professor Bolt in my department and one of his students are the people who gave me this idea. Not that I shouldn't have been smart enough to come up with it myself. But we're doing very brief profiles of statisticians in my class. So this is something that might take 2 or 3 minutes, but it's happening pretty regularly in class. And the thing about statistics is that it's a new field and it's a young field and it's constantly developing. So it's not true that all the things that you learn in an undergrad stats class are things that were discovered or promoted by old white men who are now dead. So the people that you see on the screen are some of the people that we're profiling, and they're actually the ones who are developing or using or promoting the methods that we are learning. So it's not really an artificial connection. There really is this diverse community of people who are providing the tools that we're learning to use. And so I just want to highlight that. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Stacy. Let's see. So yeah, I see that Joe and her were able to hop on after class. Thank you so much for hopping on after a full day. Joe, do you mind sharing next a little bit about what you're doing in classes or outside of classes?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for allowing me to be a part of this. Just got out of class. So I've appreciated listening to what my colleagues are saying. It's always exciting. I'm sure somebody's already said this, but it's always exciting to hear what people are doing in different disciplines and how we're integrating this content. I come from social work, so one of our core values is social justice, which includes fighting oppression, discrimination, racism. So this is sort of directly in our wheelhouse. We're also a professional program, in addition to being an academic sort of focus or discipline, which means that we have sort of an ethical obligation to do this. So when the opportunity came from Emily and Alicia and others to be involved, that felt like a very natural fit for our profession. I think we began a bit on this journey back in 2015 after the swastika incident on campus. Our department came together and at that point decided that we wanted to do annual or semi-annual teach-ins, which I think are an opportunity to do really focused academic work around an issue that we hadn't been using up until that point. So I think, you know, as others have said, you can have classes where this content comes naturally, you can be creative about it, but sometimes I think current events demand that you focus even more specifically, and teach-ins are a great tool for that. So I encourage people from all over the campus to think more about how to use that as a tool. Our experience has been that students are very receptive to hearing from their faculty ways to process very current events that aren't really appropriate to spend that much time on in the classroom. And so a teach-in is a great opportunity to do that. We've also been in the middle of a multi-year effort to diversify our readings across the entire program. So I know Global Development Studies, where I also teach, has done this too. And I'm sure other programs have as well. But just looking at, all right, who are the authors we're putting in front of our students in terms of everything from the core textbook on down to journal articles and videos? What are the voices we're bringing in? What are the voices we may be leaving out, and doing that together as an entire department to try to ensure that as students go through our program, they're encountering as much diversity of voices as they can. So that's been very helpful, and that's an ongoing project for us in social work. We've also had the opportunity to be involved with some of our living learning communities around. So we're working through with the grassroots living learning community. Again, trying to provide students outlets for, in that case, getting involved on campus in their living situation and with activism, being involved with students who want to do things. And we have professional expertise in social work, right? I teach community organizing. I'm always happy to talk with students who are like, hey, I've never thought about leading a protest or organizing a letter writing campaign. I've done those things, and I've thought about them and read books about them. And I'm always happy to talk with students about pursuing that, living out their vocation beyond the classroom. I think in direct response to the campaign in the spring, I'll just highlight two things and then I'll pass it on. One is that I've been using James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree in my social work capstone class. And again, I think for many years that class had a focus on identity and how we integrate our identity, but bringing that question of identity sort of down to earth for Christians in helping professions through that book and its examination of the cross has been really powerful, I think, and very helpful. And then some of the public work, for those of you who might have attended the event I did yesterday or read the op-ed I wrote over the summer, some of my engagement with some of our students and alumni who are interested in defunding or abolitionist perspectives on policing, and trying to think about that well as a Christian intellectual and do the discernment of how and where and when to come alongside some of those efforts that we see out in our community. So that's a bit of what I've been up to.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. I especially appreciate the encouragement regarding the teach-ins. It's always, we want to address current issues, but you're right, sometimes you don't have time in the classroom. So yeah, thank you. Herb, you want to lead us out?
Sure, I'd like to be able to share my screen too, if possible.
Okay, Caitlin's helping us do that, so maybe it'll take her a second, but hopefully
Great.
she'll do that.
Yeah, looks like I can. Okay, so this summer I worked with a couple of research students, and just in general, my research is about retention in chemistry and in science, and encouraging students to be able to, stay to their second year and then graduate eventually. And this summer in particular, we looked at, well, what are we doing for students of color? And my research student, Harold G., interviewed a lot of the students of color on campus and talked to them about what are your experiences in the classroom, and what can we do, what can faculty members do differently to make sure that students feel welcome and comfortable. And he sort of sorted those into level 1, level 2, and level 3. And then working with my department chairs, Doug Vanegren and Carolyn Anderson, we had a panel of students of color come to our first department meeting and kind of talk through this list and talk through their experiences so that everyone in the department could benefit. And it's simple things like, make sure you know how to say students' names correctly, to more complicated things like examine how your field has been whitewashed, and how do you introduce diversity into the curriculum. And so then while we were at it, we thought, well, what can we do to diversify the curriculum in chemistry? And so one thing we did was we put together a PowerPoint where we have several chemists of color, and we kind of give a short bio, and then we connect it to the course content with a question that then the students can work in small groups to answer. And we try to represent social groups that our students are coming from. So we tried to have, both domestic and international chemists of color. And we tried to, sometimes it was difficult to find someone, say, from Ghana or something like that. And so then we could even just go to university websites and try and find living chemists of color that are doing important and related work. And we put those together then into a poster. And the poster is just "Not all chemists are white men." And you might see that outside the recital hall, which is the classroom that I'm sitting outside of right now, and which is where I'm teaching chemistry these days. So it's lit very well, and it's the first thing that the students see every day when they come into the classroom. And then there is a QR code so that the students, if they want a more extensive bio on any of these chemists, there's a webpage where we go into detail on all of them. And then we'll be presenting this at the Van Andel Institute, West Michigan Research for Undergraduates, coming up in November. So yeah, a few things we're working on.
Thanks so much I love that idea of having a panel of students attend your department meeting. That's great. I might steal that. So as I'm taking a look at the chat, I would love if there's folks in attendance who have questions or things that they would like to comment on or ask to feel free to add things. Right now, we have a couple of things in there that are expressions of appreciation as well, but we would love feedback and questions too. While I give people time to do that, I had asked Penny to join us to just share a bit about what she's hearing as themes across the different things that the panelists shared. So maybe I'll let Penny join in, and then I can keep an eye on the chat.
So what I love about hearing all these different colleagues from across the campus is the innovation and the creativeness and the commitment, right? Those are themes that I think come out of hearing this broad spectrum. Just a couple things, and then, hopefully we'll have time for a few comments. I really felt like, Chad and Tracy were really encouraging us to reflect on what we do already, and then how to up the ante. How to not sit on our laurels, but actually, go that extra step and take that extra training, or consider that extra text or that article or that way to up the ante and what we're doing in terms of diversity and inclusion, expressing and inspiring a value of diversity, and then equipping and enabling our communities to be places of inclusive excellence. And then I really liked, the different examples that Steve and Elizabeth and Emily, you and Stacey really gave, where I really felt called to consider how to actively integrate diversity and inclusion and underrepresented or historically silenced voices and perspective into our courses. Sometimes for some of us, it might be a little easier as it is because of the nature of our content, as Joe and Steve had mentioned. And other times we need to be a little more creative or innovative and share ideas with our colleagues like Elizabeth and Emily and Stacey have worked on. And then I think Stacey's comment is really good too, to think about cognitive overload. So to prep those things, prep those moments of creativity where we're bringing in those voices and issues and ideas for diversity and inclusion learning, to contextualize and situate those well in our course so that there isn't that cognitive overload, and that the students are in like a good psychological space to uptake and to consider that as part of the learning, and broaden their own ideas and perspectives and understanding of diversity and inclusion. And then, of course, I'm a big fan of what Herb's doing in the chemistry department, and think that we can all work in different ways inside and outside the classroom to build for our whole community kind of our mosaic of positive images and positive associations with historically underrepresented groups and peoples in our disciplines, in our faith groups, and in our lives.
Thank you so much, Penny. I've seen a couple things come in. and some of them I'm able to view and some not. So I'll share the ones that I can see, but there may be a few more that for some reason aren't showing up for me. One question was about incidents that occur in the classroom where a comment that's made is inappropriate and hurtful to ethnic minority students. What are some ways that we're growing in our own cultural competency to be able to handle those kinds of situations? And then a second one is from Megan, a question about how we continue to stay plugged into conversations of diversity. So maybe those things are related. Would anyone like to jump in with how they've handled those situations, or how they continue to grow personally on your internal work? Yeah, Steve, go for it.
I was going to share an example from 229 that just occurred, actually. So in 229, it just so happens all of the students in the course this semester are all white Euro-American students. And I give them an opportunity to share. They do a source analysis, read a primary source, and then they present it to their colleagues. And one of the students initially, in sharing and analyzing a source from a Native American perspective, had a slide up on her PowerPoint in which the Native Americans showed on that image were all dressed in buckskin in front of teepees. But the source she had read was written by a Haudenosaunee person. The Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois, did not live in teepees and did not wear buckskin. The Haudenosaunee lived their traditional ancestral homelands are upstate New York. And the students had just actually read a chapter on that in Lowen about how the stereotype of all Native Americans live in teepees out on the plains, and Native Americans are now dead. And that's where the United States defeated them, that's it. And so there was a moment there, she finished her presentation, and in my mind, how am I going to address this? Because this is public. They're all learning how to become teachers. So I first decided to lead with something she did well in her PowerPoint, in that it wasn't text heavy. But then I just decided to ask a question. So I asked her to go back to that image and simply ask the question, the image of the Native Americans there, are those Haudenosaunee peoples? And then she paused for a moment and said, I think so. And then we were able to have a conversation about that. And in your teaching, when you do share images with your students about a group of people, you need to be very deliberate about the images you're showing, because you can reinforce stereotypes in those images. So it's a great learning opportunity. And so I find those are the moments that we need as teachers to say something. Those are learning moments and opportunities. And then in terms of the other question, as I've shared, it's a part of my field. I do sociocultural history, so staying on top or reading about racism and sexism, that's a part of what I do in my work as a historian. So I'm constantly looking for what's being written in the field to read, and in related fields. Something about history too, it's an interdisciplinary discipline. And I love to read what sociologists are writing, and anthropologists are writing, and biologists are writing, and chemists are writing, what English professors are writing. That's all relevant and helpful to understand, to have an interdisciplinary view. And I think this panel shows that, why we enjoy listening to each other, because it helps. Collaboration is a good thing. We tend to compete a lot in higher education. We ought to collaborate more.
Yeah. Chad, I see your hand. Did you want to jump about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've enjoyed listening to everybody an awful lot. I think in answer to the first question, the thing that's really been the most helpful for me in the past few months is, Penny, you facilitated a conversation with students of color over the summer where they talked about some of their experiences. And I mean, there were some points of view there that I just never, ever would have considered. And I think any opportunity that I can get, not just to listen to other faculty and what they're doing, but to hear about the student perspective. I mean, I'm getting farther and farther away from the student perspective the older I get. But in terms of race issues, that was really, really eye-opening. And I think the more of those we can do as a university, the more helpful it'll be for us as faculty.
Penny, did you want to jump in?
Sure. I would just like to encourage us to keep our eyes open for opportunities. We are rolling out the different diversity and inclusion point persons around campus, and all of you guys are working with us to roll out different opportunities and resources. So one, there's a couple websites, but there's also the Calvin News, where we send out, go look at this. Some of them are like 10-minute things, those diversity and inclusion small steps that you can access with a cup of coffee in a break. Some of them are, hour-long kind of experiences and trainings, but keep an eye out for those, because we're actually rolling a lot of stuff out, especially this fall, focusing actually on having difficult conversations and how to navigate our current polarized, tribalized political season. So it's not like something we all can't use a little more help in. And then one thing I'd like to mention is the Calvin Center for Christian Worship and the Provost Office are partnering to jumpstart a project that's going to take some of the expertise and great work in diversity and inclusion that's happening, things that have been highlighted today, and kind of capture some of that and package that for lay people to integrate some of these insights and ways of thinking and ways of going about diversity and inclusion, embodying that in our lives for lay people and for congregations. So that will hopefully start rolling out mid-spring next year. So keep an eye open for that and for invitations to be involved in that really exciting project.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I know I'm mindful of time, and so I want to make sure that I share the QR code real quick for attendees that might have to jump out. So as I'm wrapping up, I just really appreciate those several questions that were raised, and I think they bring up this idea of continued accountability. And I am thankful that students and alum continue to hold faculty accountable in these ways and ask us to continue to do that internal work. That's important. All of us on the panel value that and appreciate continuing to be held accountable and also be in discussion about that. So again, I really am thankful for everyone who came and for those that specifically that shared. Thanks again for the panelists who participated and shared, and anyone in attendance who would like to connect with any of us to ask questions. We would love to do that. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Emily.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, of course. I see one more question in the thing that maybe I'll email that attendee in particular, because it's a more specific thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, Nate. Hey, Caitlin. Thank you so much for doing tech for us.
No problem. Nate's stepped out for a second.
Oh, that's fine. I don't know why I couldn't see